Hey, and welcome back to the Braver by the Day podcast. Josh here from Australia, and today I'm talking to Chief Pete Lamb, who is a retired firefighting chief and firefighting trainer and podcaster from Massachusetts in the USA. It was a real honor to have Pete on the call. He's got some amazing stories, so make sure you stick around to the end. It's one of the most powerful podcasts I've actually had the pleasure of doing myself. I was I don't talk much in this one. I kind of was just sitting there in awe a little bit of the story, so we'll jump into the call now. And just quickly for today's show notes, braverbytheday.com/16. That's braverbytheday.com/16. So we'll jump in with Pete now. Hi everyone, it's Josh here from the Braver by the Day podcast, episode 16. For today's show notes, braverbytheday.com/16. And I'm really honoured today. My guest is Pete Lamb from petelamb.com and the Fire Training Podcast. Pete's going to tell us a lot more about himself. He's got all these amazing stories, and I think the connection, as we talked about in the pre-chat, between Australia having a lot of wildfires and big fires, and some of my family being involved in fighting fires over the summer, and Pete being such an experienced fire chief and a fire trainer. I think we're going to have a really exciting chat today, and I'm really honoured that he joined me on the show, and he's done a lot of amazing things. So I won't be taking up too much of the listeners' time today. So Pete, just take it away, mate, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive in.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Josh. I appreciate you reaching out after discovering me on YouTube. You know, I kind of forgot that podcast, this roundtable, was actually out there in perpetuity now for everybody. So great. It's really an honor to be here. You mentioned a little bit. So I had a really interesting career, if you will, and I was able to start as a young volunteer firefighter at the age of 16, actually a little bit before the age of 16. I was very involved in Boy Scouts and doing all the typical things that young teenagers do, and got involved in the firefighting aspect. We could be what was called junior firefighters, if you will. I'm not really sure what that meant at the time, but we were starting to be interested in take training and do all those sorts of things. And so I stayed with that and then became the first career firefighter in an all-volunteer organization. So it's kind of interesting being the first person, everybody's working for free and you're actually getting paid to do the job. So it's kind of a unique situation. So that was kind of interesting for me. And then I was able to progress through the ranks, quite frankly, a little too rapidly. I went through the ranks very quickly and ultimately became the chief of the fire department where I first started. I spent a period of time there, and then an opportunity presented itself to go to a larger department. So I went over to the town of Tiverton, Rhode Island, and became the fire chief there. I spent 10 years there and had another amazing opportunity. My career has been a situation where I've been presented with a number of opportunities that I always tried to move in a forward progression. So I had the opportunity to go to the Massachusetts Training Academy to take care of their recruit firefighter training program. And in a period of 4 or 5 years, I actually worked my way through the training academy and became the director of state training for the whole state of Massachusetts. A number of things happened during that time period. 9/11 happened during that time period, September 11th. There was also another very tragic fire that occurred in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, a big city in Massachusetts, where 6 firefighters were lost at one time. And so those 2 major events occurred, and I really longed to go back out in the street and serve as a line firefighter again. And so I became and had the opportunity to become the fire chief in a suburban community here south of Boston, Massachusetts. And I spent 8 years there before retiring last September. And as you mentioned, I'm still, retired from the business, if you will, but still certainly involved in training and speaking and all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of the long, boring details of how I got to where I am. And I got about 35 years experience in the business in various forms. And for that 35 years, probably, certainly 25 of those years, if not more, I served as an emergency medical technician as well. All of the fire departments that I've been involved with, we also provided the ambulance service. So my background is fire and ambulance service related. So that's the long story to a short question.
Well, that's a good story. It certainly wasn't long-winded, Pete. That's an amazing story. I didn't actually realise that there was such a close harmony between the ambulance service and the fire service in America. That really just I felt something kind of twinge in my stomach then just to think about how much more responsibility that would be, because I know, at least in Australia, the ambulance service is, I guess it's more prominent to the public as to the demands of that job and what actually goes into that. So were you handling the training for both worlds, or was it just something that you were overseeing as part of just working for the fire service? How did the ambulance thing really fit in there in your jurisdiction?
Well, it certainly in the early part of my career, I was the emergency medical technician. I mean, I spent many years in the back of the ambulance. Even in the small first department where I came from, it was a very small department. Even as I moved up in rank, I could not just sit and delegate. I actually had to be treating patients and working in the ambulance. And then as I moved to larger departments, I became the supervisor, where I would oversee the operation of the ambulance. And I would say that in America, and certainly my experience in the departments that I was with, I would say that the ambulance service is, well, I'm going to take a wild guess here. No science to this, but certainly 70 to 75% of the American fire service's responses are somehow medically related, whether they provide the ambulance or whether they send the fire apparatus out first to begin some basic treatment. It's almost 75% of our workload.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, that's one of the main things that I hope my listeners go away and check out your show for. And that's that you have such amazing stories like that, and just you expose a whole world, I guess, that probably doesn't get a lot of recognition outside of the industry itself. And also for anyone who might have already picked up on it out of my audience, Pete, you're probably one of the few people I know online that has had a quite elite career, that is very quick to point out yourself where you think you might have made mistakes, and you don't sugarcoat those things. Moving maybe towards what you do now with the training and the podcast and everything you've been doing with speaking lately, is that something you find really resonates with new firefighters coming into the service, and maybe some more indentured firefighters, is your stories and how you're not afraid to say that you might have stuffed a few things up along the way and made a few bad calls? Because I know that's probably what resonates most about your show with me as a non-firefighter. It's just that you're so bloody honest, mate.
Yeah, well, my show's different, and I appreciate you listening to some of the episodes, not being a firefighter. My show is really geared toward the firefighters, although some people have a mild interest in the fire service. They might get some of the technical out of it. But really and truly, I find, and I learned some lessons the hard way. And I feel that I think I just mentioned this in a recent episode of mine. The head of the National Fire Academy, we have a National Fire Academy in the United States. I'm not sure whether you have a fire college in Australia or not, but at the National Fire Academy, the head of the National Fire Academy, the superintendent, is very quick to make this phrase. And I really took to it, and I'm trying to put it into practice. And his phrase is this: why don't we give some people an education from someone who has already paid the tuition? If I've made a mistake in my career, sure, it's embarrassing. I'm not proud of my mistakes, certainly. But if I can save a young firefighter or a new chief, a newly appointed chief officer, or a young captain or a lieutenant, if I can tell him something where I made a significant mistake, and quite frankly, am I skilled or am I lucky? I guess whether you determine whether you're skilled or lucky is how long it lasts. If it's luck, it's probably short term. If it's skill, it lasts longer. But the fact that I'm able to admit some mistakes doesn't make me any better or any worse. I really just am trying to make the place a little better. The point of me being in the fire service is to leave it a little better than I found it. And I really, it sounds corny. It sounds self-effacing or what have you, but I really believe in that. And if I can share something and prevent somebody, our mistakes, Josh, as you well know, whether it's fire or ambulance, if I worked in a factory and we didn't make 3 widgets today, then 3 widgets didn't get made. But my mistakes will certainly they can literally be life or death. They're not life or death every day, but they certainly can result in that. So if I can pass on a mistake and swallow my own embarrassment that I did a dumb thing, then maybe somebody can prevent that mistake in their own career, and they'll be a little better because of my mistake. So that's how I feel, and I don't mind passing those things on. I never, ever tell the real embarrassing ones, though, Josh. I got to tell you, I hold those for myself.
Okay. I think the stories are fantastic anyway. One that really resonates with me, actually, is a story that I'd never really thought about, and that's some of the extra dangers that someone in like an elite service such as fire service might face. And I think one that you might have mentioned was the number of service officers in America, whether they're fire or ambulance or whatever particular service they're in, who actually maybe get into accidents in their own vehicle on the way to responding to a pager call. I think it might have been a pager call or a tech, however those calls are sent out now. And that's something that really just resonated with me. Obviously, I'm not in those services, but it made me, when I was on my walk that day, far, far more aware of the world and just to be more aware of my own actions at the time. And I don't know if anyone's told you that about your show, but I mean, I've listened to a lot of episodes, more working up to this call. And to be honest, it's really resonated with me far more strongly than what I ever thought it would, for that very reason, that I feel in every episode that you're kind of giving away something that can be applied outside of the fire service as well, that it's good to be aware of your world and to really take notice of your surroundings. Is that something that anyone's brought up with you before, or am I just a little bit diving in a bit too deep there on the hidden messages?
No, it's really not a hidden message. I'm pretty blatant. I throw it right out there, but
Yeah.
no, it is something that I have been told before, and we talk about a little bit. If I can just go down a little rabbit hole here, and that is that the fire service has been so interesting for me for one reason, well, for many reasons actually, but a key reason is, as everything in society changes, so has my job had to change. I think about when I got on the fire department, 1975, 76, in that time frame. When we went to an automobile accident, it was an all-steel vehicle. Today, all of our vehicles are plastic. They might be hybrid. They might be fueled by compressed natural gas. Everything has changed in society. And people need to realize that everything they do, just the furnishings that people put in their house now, as you well know, that we had a horrible tragedy here many, many years ago in a nightclub in a small town in Rhode Island. There was 100 people killed in a nightclub fire, and everyone was astounded because there was foam, sound dampening foam in this nightclub. And after the fire, I began to speak to people, and I was out, and people know I'm a firefighter, and they said, well, what do you think? And what about this? And what about that? And I said, you see the couch that we're sitting on? It has as much foam in it as was in that nightclub. And people really don't understand our business. I'm glad you raised that point. You were talking about driving. If you have an all retained or an all volunteer fire service, and you have some of those in Australia as well, but in the United States, there's about 70% of our country is protected by volunteer firefighters. Well, how do they get to the fire station? They have to use their own vehicle, and they have a sense of urgency about it. And we encourage them to drive safely. But a firefighter who truly is at his heart or at his core, realizing there's somebody in need, they tend to accelerate. They tend to drive faster. They tend to take chances. Now, I certainly don't condone that, and I look to be an advocate for safety. But you also have to understand that we're in a human business. And a human reaction to try to help someone else in need is a pretty powerful emotion. It's not something that you turn on and off. So sometimes our younger members tend to drive in an unsafe manner because their heart is in the right place in trying to help others. But I often tell them when we're training that you can't help anyone if you don't get there. And so that driving thing you mentioned is very, very important, and it's certainly something that comes to mind. But society learning really, I have friends that I meet occasionally, and they say, "Well, I never knew a fireman had to do that. I never knew a firefighter or a paramedic had to do that." And so there's a lot about our business that remains a mystery, as well publicized and popularized in the movies and the TV. There are a lot of things folks really don't know about us.
That's awesome. That was a great answer, mate. And that's something that I wanted to maybe dive into a little bit later, Pete, is the juxtaposition between what actually happens in maybe a firefighter's day, whether they respond to a call or not, or to an emergency, and maybe what the glorified Hollywood version is, because I'm sure that particularly for people outside of the US, and it happens in Australia as well, I think we know as humans to respect the role that firefighters play and other service officers in the community, but we might not actually understand the pressures and the amount of training and the dedication that all those things take. So that might segue into our next question more directly, and that's Braver by the Day is a show about habit change, persistence, and grit. And how important are those concepts for firefighters in your experience? And how central are they to maybe becoming a great firefighter as opposed to maybe someone that doesn't make the cut, for the lack of a better term? Sorry, I know that's not an industry term, but that's the Australian version. So how important are those particular character traits and the ability to adapt habits and to rule out bad habits for a firefighting service and maybe an individual firefighter too?
Sure, those are great things, and when you talk about changing habits, persistence, grit, those traits that you identify and you pull right out, and that is the core of what you're speaking about. When I'll give you an example in training young recruit firefighters. A young recruit firefighter today, and as society changes, Josh, you realize that our recruits change. The people come in a little differently. There was a whole generation of firefighters that came out of, World War II. They were World War II veterans, and they came out of a military and fighting a war. And there was a whole certain mindset that gravitated into the fire service, and that was prevalent for a long, long time. But of course, as we know, that's 20 years ago. Those firefighters have long retired or passed away or passed on. So the newer firefighter comes into us as a young recruit, as a young individual who has been brought up in such a manner that he can do what he wants when he wants, so on and so forth. Sort of a free spirit, if you will. And we begin to start to form him into a situation where the young firefighter now must become part of a team. Your thoughts matter, absolutely. But what matters is the way the whole team comes to play and your role on that team. And it's difficult to mold them and shape them. The other thing that happens when you talk about persistence is for young firefighters, you think a couple of things that normal human beings, and firemen are normal too, I might add, but regular average persons who are not firefighters, it's pretty common that they have a fear of the dark. They might be claustrophobic, and they might have a fear of heights. Well, those are a couple of interesting traits if you're going to be in the fire service. Those are things that you might want to correct pretty easily. And we see young firefighters. It's an interesting transformation when you're training them, because they may come to you and they certainly have fear of being in a confined space, fear of being in the dark, all of those sorts of things. Are typically and I'm sure it's the same in Australia, you have what we call aerial devices, aerial ladders to go up in the air. Well, that's about 100 feet in the air on an average. And so you take a firefighter who may never have, he joined the fire service and really has never been on anything more than a 6-foot step ladder. And you then explain to him why he's going to climb up 10 stories. And those are difficult. And so what we try to do is this persistence. One of the things that firefighters have learned, and one of the things I learned as a young firefighter, you can go a little farther than you think you can. And your mind sort of puts up artificial barriers for you. I can't do that. That's too high. I won't be able to do that, and so on and so forth. And what we try to teach people is the persistence to go a little further and to go a little higher and to go beyond, the cliche, go beyond your comfort zone in terms of training. Because at the time, you're going to need that skill. Your adrenaline is going to take over. And people say, you want to default to your training. When your anxiety level is up and all of those things are there, you want to make sure you train until you can't fail. that when you're in an emotional state, your training will take over and carry you. And it's not any different than, the military services or any of the police services, our brothers in blue or any of those things. It's really not any different than that, except that what we try to do is push on. And one of the things that we tell firefighters is this: if someone is trapped in a burning residence, and we go to all kinds of fires, but I'll use the burning residence as an example. If someone is trapped in that house because of heavy smoke and they can't get out, you're it. They called you. There is nobody else coming. We don't have anyone else to call. And as a firefighter, you are the last line of defense. So you have to give a little bit more than you would, and you have to go above and beyond your comfort zone to be able to push a little bit farther. It's really hot, and it's getting hotter, and it's getting worse, and it's getting darker, and it's getting blacker. You've got to go forward because you are the only chance that the civilian has in that residence. And it is one of the things I'm proud of the American Fire Service. We lose a lot of members, and that's unfortunate. And there are people all over this country trying to cut down the number of loss of life of firefighters because it's dramatic. Our ratio of losing firefighters is much higher than any other country. But I think that part of our training and part of this persistence and part of this can-do attitude is really part of a firefighter's being. It's part of the fiber of their being. There's an interesting story, I don't know, 20 years ago, I guess, and I don't remember the exact date, but there was a plane that went down in the Florida Everglades. I forget the airlines. It's really not important. But the plane went down in the middle of the Florida Everglades. And there is the most interesting piece of video that I saw as a young firefighter. And it makes me smile every time I tell this story. The video was kind of a command post. And there were police officers and all sorts of people and firemen and I don't know, people from the FAA, the Aeronautics Administration, and all this sort of stuff. And there's a discussion about we have to go out in the middle of the swamp because the plane nosedived and it buried the black box deep into the swamp. And so in this command post that someone's videoing, they're talking about, there's sawgrass, there's snakes, there's alligators, there's, how are we going to do this or whatever. And there's a group of Miami Metro-Dade firefighters from the state of Florida. And everybody's standing there all stymied about how we're going to do this. And the firemen, yeah, we'll go. We'll go. Yeah, just send us. We'll go. And it just made me smile. And I said, there's all these agencies and all these forces in play. And when nobody can figure out how to do this, this fireman goes, yep, pick me. I'm the guy. I'll go out there and get that. Don't care about the alligators and the snakes and whatever it is. I'll do it. And that's what I think embodies a firefighter to some degree. Now, I'm certainly not any braver than the next guy, and I certainly don't have 100 medals on my chest in the fire service. But I like to believe that in some ways I helped move this organization forward in a similar fashion. I hope that I've held those traditions close to my heart and tried to be that example for others. So I think that persistence for a firefighter and grit, never giving up, I think is paramount. So hopefully that helped.
Wow, that was fantastic, mate. That was very powerful. I'm a little bit taken back by some of those stories. So, as I said, for the listener, Pete tells amazing stories. So I guess that just for me brings up something that I hadn't really thought about, and that's with my two brothers. I remember how scared I was when there was a large number of bushfires and they got quite close to my family home growing up. And I was thinking, wow, that's still probably about maybe 2 kilometres away, which would be, 1.5 miles, I guess. And I was thinking, wow, that seems really close. And then I actually never put the thought into the fact that I think about my brothers as being just these normal guys. Like, they're very capable, very intelligent, athletic guys. But when they were young, 18, 19, they were the first ones with their hands up wanting to run into the bush and fight these fires so the local farmers didn't lose their farms and all that. So yeah, that actually kind of moved me a little bit personally, Pete. So yeah, thanks for sharing those stories. And yeah, for anyone who is listening, you're going to get a lot of stories that are just as powerful as that out of Pete's show. So I've actually re-listened to a few of the episodes for that reason. So we might just move on now, mate. So is there anything else you wanted to say about the persistence and grit thing now that I've gone on my little soliloquy there?
No, I think that's really it. And you were just mentioning about protecting the farms and protecting the family homes. I make a parallel. It kind of ties to the persistence and grit. I make a parallel when your house is burglarized or someone steals something from you, they will steal whatever they can carry. When a fire takes your house, it takes everything. It takes the pictures off the walls. It takes the jewelry. It takes your memories. It takes everything. And so when you think about the burglary or the thief in the night, they will take whatever they can get. A fire is merciless. And I think that the firefighters, one of the most difficult things for a firefighter is to lose a civilian life, is to lose massive amounts of property, is to lose certainly the loss of a brother firefighter or a brother member, I think is important. But fires take everything. And I think the importance of having a fire service, whether it's volunteer or career, and, there's all sorts of political nightmares that come with the fire departments in the States now. As the economy gets worse, there's pressure on firefighters. And, we sort of stand as the last bastion of defense, if you will. And sometimes, people ask me, well, how many firefighters do I need in a community? And I ask them if their house is on fire. And if they say no, I say, well, you don't need any. But if your house is on fire, you might need 20 or 30. So it really depends what's your point of view at the time you ask the question. So that's something I wanted to add. But
well, thanks for elaborating on that. And that's a good roundup of maybe that first section of the interview. So we might just move on now, Pete, and maybe just talk a little bit outside of maybe the fire service and some of the things that you've seen in relation, once again, to habit change and the persistence and grit factors that you think may actually be applicable not just to firefighters but to people in everyday life. Is there any particular things that you've seen or techniques or methods of communication that you've seen in your own professional career change people that you think might actually be more applicable across the board in general day-to-day life?
Yeah, I think a little bit of the regimentation, a little bit of a routine. A fireman will do the same thing every morning. A fireman will check the equipment, even though that the men getting off the shift check the equipment before. A fireman will check the equipment again. And I think that it's that attention to detail can be applied to so many facets of life in general. Just developing a routine and developing a regimen that you no longer firefighters generally don't become complacent. And I think so many people in society today take things for granted. The firefighter will do some things repetitively and repeatedly so that there is nothing missed. And I think the attention to detail and the focus is just tremendous. I think that's a life lesson. I think the other life lesson is that many firefighters, if not all firefighters, continue their training. There is so much. I think if you said to a firefighter today, there's so much they don't know. And I'm talking about very highly skilled, highly experienced people. There's always something that you can learn. There's always something that you can train on. And there's technical, people use the term, did you get trained on something or did you get educated? Well, I kind of lump them both together. I understand education is a higher level and training is more hands-on and vocational. But I think the thirst for knowledge, as well as that repetitive, focused behavior, the thirst for knowledge and continuing knowledge is important. A firefighter is trained several hours every day. In my department, most recently, consistently a minimum of a couple of hours of training, 2 to 3 hours of training every day. Now, folks would say, well, gee, professional athletes practice 5 or 6. Well, that's true. But professional athletes don't practice always 5 or 6 on the day they're going to play the game. Firefighters will train 2 or 3 hours, but they can't expend themselves because they need to be ready for any emergencies that will occur in the course of their tour of duty. So I think that the focus, I think the training and education, and I think the willingness to serve. The society is changing, and I think you see it, Josh, and I've certainly seen it in the course of my lifetime. Firefighters at some level care about people. And I think that caring about others and caring about trying to help someone else is really kind of a nice cause. And I don't mean run in and save their life, and I don't mean do cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR on them. I'm talking about helping your neighbor. And, that's a technique and that's a trait that a firefighter is noted for. We have, I joke with people that are on Facebook, I have 300 friends. Well, I bet you probably got 5. When you think about the people who are going to help you in the time of emergency on Christmas Eve at 2 a.m, it's probably not all 300 of your Facebook friends. It's probably a handful. So I think that people could take the sense of spirit of helping others that could apply in everyday life. So those are just kind of a couple of simple things that translate from the fire service to everyday life. And I think that that's important. I think that those are things that could carry forward. And as you mentioned, maybe I want to quit smoking. Well, maybe it's the focus and the attention and the regimentation and the education and training. All of those things that I mentioned can apply in many areas of general life and everyday life. So I think those are just some that come to my mind.
That's excellent. In regards to just that day-to-day regimentation, Pete, I mean, you've expanded upon a little bit that the guys have a certain amount of training that they do. And one thing that I've just been wondering while you were saying that is, where is that balance? And is that something that an experienced firefighter knows that an inexperienced firefighter doesn't? How much they need to hold in the tank? And maybe if you are, obviously, I don't know how long a shift is over there, but I know in Australia a firefighter shift can get quite long. When you're doing a small amount of training a day and there's the rest of the day, how do you deal with just the anxiety of just not knowing what's coming or whether something's coming, and maybe in the advent of you just have a whole shift where nothing happens? Is that something that, as a chief, that you need to keep an eye on, that the team is still being productive and communicating and staying focused even if they're not actually physically exerting themselves? Because I can imagine just being under that pressure of knowing maybe I have to go do something and then not knowing when that's going to happen might actually add to the mental strain of being a firefighter. I mean, that's obviously I'm speaking a little out of house there, but I was just wondering if you could speak to that, because anxiety is something that leads people to make pretty silly decisions sometimes in their day-to-day life. So I'm trying to bring it back to being applicable to an everyday person there.
Sure. I think the anxiety of waiting for the bell really lends itself to the newest firefighters. An experienced firefighter will not be wondering what the next call is. They may think about it, but the anxiety level, the longer you've been on, really diminishes. And most firefighters will say something like, maybe there'll be a fire today. Maybe today is the day, or, there'll be that kind of coffee talk at the kitchen table, if you will, in the morning about what the day will bring. And you asked a question about the shifts, and typically in the United States, shifts are 24 hours in length. So you would go to work at, let's say, 0800 in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning. You would work the entire 24-hour shift until the next day, and then there are different schedules. You'd have a day off or a couple of days off, and then repeat the cycle again. So what does a day look like? So the firefighter comes to work and he probably changes into his uniform. As you know, we live in the fire station. So he goes to his locker and he gets his uniform on and makes himself look presentable. Probably is there early. If his shift changes at 8 o'clock, it's not unusual to see firefighters coming in at 7:15, 7:30, so that the person who's coming off their shift, who maybe has had a busy night, very commonly, we will come in and relieve that person early. You don't want to be the firefighter who just arrives on the bell, if you will, the person who comes in at the last second. So they'll have a little bit of coffee. And the very first rule of the day is to check all of the equipment. The engineer, the driver will check the truck. the oil, the fluids, all those sorts of things, the fuel, make sure everything is good to go. Every firefighter checks his own breathing apparatus and the tools he's assigned to. And so that check may take an hour, hour and a half, depending on how much apparatus you have in your particular station. They will do that. It will check all their radio and emergency equipment, all their personal protective equipment they wear, their helmet, their coats, and so forth. That's about 60 pounds of gear that we wear between the coat and the breathing apparatus. So that's checked. And then typically they could do inspections for a couple of hours, which is sort of light duty. You're not, it's paperwork duty, if you will, but you're out in your response area inspecting buildings, seeing if there are any hazards that can be prevented. And then at some point, there will be 2 to 3 hours of training. And it's usually an officer who will make sure that firefighters are not getting totally spent. Or what they'll do is they'll train 3 firefighters pretty heavy, and they'll hold 3 in reserve. And then they'll train those 3 in reserve pretty heavy while the other 3 are recouping and rehabbing, if you will. And they will take whatever runs they happen to take in the middle of them. If there is a particularly heavy run, we think about every day there's not a fire, certainly, but there are a number of things. And as I said, we do an awful lot of, you mentioned about firefighters in automobile accidents. We do an awful lot of automobile accidents. We had an interstate highway that ran through us, and we were always out there. And so if you've had to extricate a person using the jaws of life or whatever, those are pretty intensive tasks. So the officer may say, hey, we're not training today because we just had that run, or we'll just recap what occurred on that particular incident, and that will be our training for the day. So although there's a planned training schedule, the officer, as you said, will monitor what's going on and adjust the day as it goes. As far as the anxiety of what's coming next, that really does go away after a period of time, because literally, Josh, you would make yourself crazy sitting around and saying, what if? Now, I have to tell you, as a young firefighter, I think about, my very first shift. And it was funny, we had a manual transmission fire truck. And I had my left foot, of course, on the clutch trying to shift. And my left foot was shaking up and down so violently, I didn't know whether I was having a medical emergency or it was just nerves. I think about that very first day. And so the anxiety as you begin to get experience, I don't want to say that you get cocky or you overrate yourself. But if you've been on the job for a number of years, you are mentally ready for that next thing that hits. We don't know what's going to happen the next time the bell rings. So you're ready for it. I'll take whatever comes. And, occasionally you get surprised, certainly. But I think that anxiety tends to wane as you get on further in your career.
That's excellent, Pete. And that probably leads directly into my next question. And that's, as a non-US resident, when I think about the bravery, which is part of the name of my own show, and then I think about the US in general, it may be because of that aforementioned media attention that firefighters have gotten in the US media and worldwide in the last 15 years-ish. But I do think of firefighters when I think of the prototypical American hero. I don't know if that's how the best way to say that, but it's something that you guys obviously have, and there just seems to be such a strong story and culture of, as you said earlier, of just being the first people to say, yes, we want to take that on, or we want to be there, we want to help people. How do you as a fire chief get your crew to, show that bravery and also to keep that story alive? And is it through the stories of previous, like yours type of stories where you're saying about things that have happened to you in the past, or is like, what's that process involved? Because it just seems like such a rich culture of amazing and strong moving stories that have led to the firefighter being held in that esteem in the US. Because I guess in Australia, just for some perspective, firefighters are slightly less public maybe, and maybe not held in that regard, which I think is completely unfair, particularly now that I know more about what firefighters struggle with listening to your podcast. How do you frame all that as far as keeping that story alive and really injecting that bravery into your new recruits and people that have been with you a long time?
Well, I think there's several things. I think, the short answer is the continued training. A person, there's a very famous quote that all American firefighters know, and I'm sure probably the Australian firefighters as well. There was a fire chief in the city of New York, and this was said or written, actually put in print in somewhere around 1905, the early 1900s, and his name was Edward Croker. And the fire chief at that time, Chief Croker, said that a firefighter's first act of bravery is completed when he signs up and takes the job because he's agreed to do something. So I think that there's a little inherent bravery. If someone wants to come into this profession, they kind of sort of know. Much like half a world away, something about the bravery of the American firefighter. So someone who's trying to get into this profession certainly knows a little bit about that ahead of time. And I mentioned this in one of my podcasts, but if I could just share one story, one of the things that we train our firefighters on early in the recruit process is what we call history and traditions. And one of the histories of the American firefighter actually goes back to ancient Rome. And if you could just indulge me for a second, it was the short story is this was the Knights of St. John. It was knights, right? The persecution and all of that time period in history. The Knights of St. John, during the battles of certain castles and takeovers or what have you, they would attack the castle by throwing flaming branches. And they had a substance, we would call it naphtha, almost gasoline today, of course, not refined, but a substance called naphtha. And they would pour naphtha over people and throw flaming branches and flaming arrows. And the Knights of St. John had a peculiar tunic, and it had this cross on it. And they ultimately settled in Malta. And they would not partake in the battles. They would only rush in after the battles to help people who had been affected and were actually threatened by the fire. And that cross, when they settled on Malta, ultimately became what we know now as the Maltese Cross. And the Maltese Cross is the symbol of the American firefighter. And that cross, to this day, you notice in any photograph, it's on our T-shirts, it's on our patches, it's on our helmets. Everywhere you look in the American Fire Service is a Maltese Cross. And we go back to the 1600s, that a person wearing that cross is a person who will help someone who has been threatened or in danger by fire. And I think when you tell that in detail, I just gave you a very snapshot lesson of that. But when you begin to speak that and you say it from your heart with a passion to a young recruit firefighter, and you say, listen, if you're going to put that shirt on, you have to live up to a standard that has been living around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I also think that if you train people, when you talk about what does the fire chief do, two things. If the fire chief shows technical competence and technical expertise in his field, if I'm out in front of the building and I'm panicking, well, that certainly doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in my crew. But if I'm able to maintain my composure and I have technical soundness and technical competence, and I have begun to train them the right way, success, each fire and emergency and incident they go to where they have had success, they begin to become a little more confident and therefore a little more brave each and every time. And as we begin to train them and challenge them, as I mentioned early on, outside of their comfort zone, they begin to say, hey, wait a minute, I've done something worse than this before. I was in a fire that was hotter than this before. I was up higher on a ladder than I am today. Whatever it is they compare it to. And as a chief officer and as a trainer, what I would say to someone when they were faced with a challenge, I'd say, well, what about that thing we did last week? What about last Tuesday? You got by that all right. You can do this. And that's how it goes. So the fire chief really becomes a coach. The fire chief becomes the coach. And I think technical competence in yourself and confidence in your abilities, continued training, and positive experiences on the crew make them braver, if you will. And firefighters, and I would tell you, Josh, I'm a little embarrassed to be on a show Braver by the Day, because I'm not any braver than anyone else. And there are people that have done, I sit back and I look at these folks in the fire service that have done much more greater things than I. So any firefighter would tell you he's not really braver than the next person. He may stay around a little bit longer than the next person and move a little farther in than the next person. But they don't consider themselves brave. They consider themselves confident and successful, or what have you. So I think that's what the chief can do, is show competence and confidence yourself and continue to train and make your personnel better than you. My job is to make a new fireman better than I was, so that they can be safe and go home to their family.
That was very powerful. Thanks, Pete. You've even spoken to my next question, and I ask every guest really strongly there already, I think, and that's, how do you deal with the fear of failure, and how would you help your team do that? Do you have anything else to expand upon that more directly? Because I think you've just pretty much answered it really well already, but I'm sure that you've got maybe a story in there or something that you might be able to speak to on the fear of failure.
Well, I would tell you my fear of failure was a deep one, and I didn't suffer it. But my fear of failure was this: I've been at incidents where civilian lives have been lost. I've been to any number of firefighter funerals in my time or whatever. But my fear of failure as a chief, and fortunately I've since retired, so I survived this one. My fear of failure was fires are unpredictable. Fires change all the time, and as much as we understand the science and the building construction and all of the technical things that come with it, and I considered myself to have a little bit of, shall we say, intestinal fortitude. I thought I had a little bit of that. One of my greatest fears as a chief officer was knocking on the door of a young family, a wife or some children, and saying that their firefighter who worked for me did not come home tonight. And if I was in charge of an incident where a firefighter lost his life, I've been in charge of an incident where firefighters have gotten injured, but never had a loss of life. My fear was always that I would have to go and knock on that door. And I would tell you that was something real for me. I wanted to excel, and I wanted to make sure all the time I was fighting the fire that no one ever got in a position where they lost their life. And not that when a firefighter loses his life, it's always the failure of the chief. It isn't. But there's a sense of responsibility when you're doing something in this fashion. And again, I never wanted to lose a civilian life, but that happened. But that fear of failure that I had, and again, I'm speaking from the heart here, that, I never wanted to experience having to go tell someone that their loved one did not come home tonight because of something that I did. And I think that I got by that. But I think that is a fear. When you speak about fire chiefs, that might be the fear that they have. Whether or not they would speak about it remains to be seen. But I think that would be a real life fear that they would have.
Wow, that was powerful. I know that I'm saying that a lot, mate, but your stories just really hit home for me, and I'm sure they do for the listener as well. And that's something that I really appreciate that you've been sharing so much, as you said, from the heart. And as I said earlier, for the listener, if these stories are resonating with you, whether you're involved in a fire service or not in Australia, the US, Canada, or wherever, and you want to just hear more of Pete's stories, I definitely would check out the show. You're going to get that kind of honesty in every episode. So I just wanted to maybe just start winding up the official part of the call now, Pete. And if you didn't mind, I wanted to ask you maybe a couple of questions quickly after we finish up the call, just about Boston in general and that area, or Massachusetts, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
I was just wondering if you just might be able to let the listeners know where they can find the show, where they can find your website, if you wanted to direct people there. And if you had any just last pieces of advice coming from such a distinguished fire chief and someone I would consider very brave, and now having spoken to in person, a very humble and honest man. Is there anything you wanted to leave the listener with that you think might resonate with them and they can go and make a bit of a change in their own life tomorrow or the next day or whenever this comes out, sort of thing? So,
no, I think try to help others, make the place a little better than you left it. If you're a civilian and you're listening to this show, the next time you hear a siren, whether you're a religious person or not, if you're a religious person, say a silent prayer. If you hear a siren go by, maybe you're not a religious person, just have a quiet moment and think about those firefighters that are out there helping someone. You know, often people would drive by and they'd say, well, every time I drive by the fire station, all the fire trucks are there and the firefighters are hanging around. And I used to say very, very candidly, isn't that a wonderful thing? Because the day you drive by an open firehouse, someone is having the worst day of their life. So I would ask the civilians that listen to your show, wherever they are. I've got listeners in my show in Sweden, all over the world. The internet has shrunken the world, if you are. Whenever you see a fire engine or an ambulance or hear a siren, think about those men and women that are on that fire truck and give them a little bit of a silent hope for safety, if you will. And if folks wanted, I'd love to hear feedback. I'd love to hear stuff that's out there. Very simple one. My email is pete@petelamb.com. My website is www.petelamb.com. And the podcast that Josh has been so generous in referring to is Firefighter Training Podcast. A little bit technical, talks about how to fight fires, and if you're a firefighter, you would get a lot out of it. If you're a civilian and had a passing interest, you would get something out of it, certainly. You can find me in iTunes, Stitcher, most of the major podcast distribution networks I'm listed on, and we'd love to have you stop by and tell us what you think, leave a rating or a review, or send us some feedback. And Josh, once again, thank you so much for your generous offer to be a guest on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Pete, for just sharing your stories and taking time out of your day, your weekend, actually, just the start of your weekend, to join me and my listeners and maybe help us change our lives for the better, mate. So thank you very much, and I'll link up all of Pete's podcast links. They're free everywhere too. I don't think we mentioned that. His show is also free in iTunes and all the directories, and petelamb.com. So that'll be in the show notes at braverbytheday.com/16. That's braverbytheday.com/16. And just once again, I'm very honored to have had you on the call, Pete, and I'll see you soon, mate.
Okay. Thank you.